Ladies and gentlemen, I think we might be live here. Yes, we are. All right, perfect. It's the first time streaming. Today we will be talking about the French Revolution, okay? And specifically, we're going to be seeing if this revolution was, as the mainstream talks about it, a grassroots upheaval against the king. They wanted a republic, or if it was actually planned, prepared, and orchestrated by elites. And so, yeah, this is what we're going to be seeing here today. All right, let's just dive into it. So, today we're going to be doing the first part. We're going to actually go over the French Revolution, the causes, and what actually happened during the revolution to really have a foundation to understand what was happening, what actually happened. And then the second live will be exposing the the dark truth, the truth that hides beneath what the all the people who write the books and the people on the news tell you. We'll be answering specifically this question: was the revolution planned? Were there people who had the intention of up upheaving the French monarchy? And did they use propaganda and all the tactics to do so, or was it just kind of the people who, were fed up with it and decided on their own? All right. So, in our first part, we're going to be looking at the society before the revolution, then the elements that caused the revolution, and then probably another live stream, the succession of events of the actual revolution itself. Alright, so let's get into it now. So, you've got to understand that the Ancien Regime, which is what the the state was called in France back then, was really divided between three classes: the nobles, the clergy, and the peasants. And this goes back hundreds, even thousands of years. And so let's look into the nobles first. At around the 18th century, they were around 130,000 people, and there was the king, at that time, Louis the 16th, at the top. So, the history. It all goes back to, you had the fall of the Roman Empire of the West, and then, so the Gaul, which is France, breaks up into a multiple like hundreds of small kingdoms, and you have to wait 500 years until Charlemagne, for him, and he was the king of the Franks, for him really to conquer the whole area. And Charlemagne was really a important figure. First of all, well, he united the whole he united, what was it? It was France, Germany, a little bit of Italy, Switzerland, a little bit of England. And so he united them all, and he really imposed the Christian religion upon his whole kingdom. And that's why um you had, before that, even you had Clovis. He was the first king in Gaul who became Christian. I think it was around 490 after Jesus Christ. And so Charlemagne unifies it all, but then when he dies, it gets split up again with his three sons, and then again with their like multiple sons, and so France never gets united. And so then so that was like around 1000 when Charlemagne lived, and so you have to wait. So as you can see in these maps, you have 1180 on the right side, and you have these kingdoms more large. You have like Aquitaine, you have the Toulouse area, Normandy, Bretagne, and these And the whole point of this is they would marry and then they would join together and then separate again. It was extremely confusing time. And so even you see France in 1477, it's just a bunch of kingdoms. But then you also see, if you look at Domaine Royal, which is what the French king. And so how it worked, it's like called the Vassalic pyramid. So you have the king at the top, and then under him you have the Grand Seigneur, which is like the Seigneur of Bretagne, of of the other things, Comte de Provence, I can see there, Bourgogne, and so you have these Grand Seigneurs in underneath them, and they're not fully in his control, but like if the French king wants to go to war, they have to support him, and there's other duties. And so underneath these Grand Seigneurs, then you have the Petit Seigneur. These are the kind of not like seigneur of the actual castle. You have one castle in this city, one castle in that city. And so you have a really pyramid, and under that are the knights, and so the knights pay tribute to the king, to the lord of that castle, and that's the system. You've probably seen it. It's just like a pyramid, and so this continues all the way until really Louis the 14th, which is able to fully unify France under him. Before then, as I was saying, there's Grand Seigneur, and they are kind of under the control of the French monarch, but not really. And it's until Louis the 14th who really unifies them. Louis the 14th, which is probably the most important king in French history. And so after Louis the 14th, you then have, he lives, I think he reigns for like 76 years. And then after that, he outlives, I think, his son and his grandson. So it's his great grandson, Louis the 15th, I believe, who gets the throne. And he lives for a long time because he got the throne when he was young. And so he outlives his son. And then it's his little son, Louis the 16th, who is then heir to the throne around his 20s, I think. He was like 19 when his grandpa died. And so what happens is you have Louis the 14th, who's really the greatest king France has ever seen, the Roi du Soleil, they call him. And you slowly have a degradation of the kings until you have Louis the 16th. And we'll see with Louis the 15th, there was a 7 Years' War, which was really started the revolution, but we'll see that later. Okay, so let's talk about the nobility again. So if you really think about it, we always say there's three divisions: the nobility, clergy, and the peasantry, but there's really seven, and you'll see why. So in the nobility, there's two. There's the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe. And so the nobility of the sword is what I was talking about. It's nobility from the Middle Ages, the old knights that were able to get lands and they built a castle, and slowly they became nobles, and over time they grew more wealth. But the actual the nobility of the sword is again subdivided into um two types. There's the nobles of the courts and there's the nobles of the provinces. And so, descended from the medieval warrior autocracy, ancient and hereditary. Yes, you have to. You guys probably know this, but the nobility, of course, it goes from in France. It not like in England. France, it goes from eldest son to eldest son to eldest son. There's no daughters, and so they would pensions and largesse from the royal bounty. So yeah, they would get a bit of money from the king. um, and so let's talk about this. There's the nobles of the court, and these are like around 1,000 families that lived in Versailles, lived in the court. That's what Versailles was called. So whenever I talk about the court, it's normally Versailles. And so these were the extremely rich nobles. Of course, all nobles, they didn't work, but these guys lived like luxuriously, even for the time. And they would get they had enormous wealth. They would get enormous pensions of like 350,000 francs, which is massive for the time. and were preoccupied with the king. You know, they would have lavish parties with the king, and this when you think of the nobles, this is what you think of, the nobles of the courts. And so on the other side, you have the nobles of the provinces. This is the rest of the nobles, the ones that actually lived on their castles, in their seigneurie. And so many were land rich, which means they owned a lot of land, but they were really poor. And you got to realize that a lot of these were just slowly losing money over time because nobles didn't work. And to work when you are noble is kind of like giving up your noble title. And so these guys have received no favors from the king except the small pensions they got. Their sons were trained in the army, and this is what I found interesting researching all this, is that I don't know if you guys knew, but Napoleon was actually a noble of the province. We don't really talk about this. He was noble, even though like he wasn't like an actual noble we think of, and so that's why he went into the army. And then, and so these nobles right here, they didn't really like the system in place. They weren't like for absolute change and destruction of the whole system, but they also didn't really want it to keep going because, and you see this with Napoleon, who kind of benefited and rode on the revolution to get higher up in the echelons. And so this is what the nobles of the provinces, even though they were nobles, they really couldn't get into high positions like the nobles of the court. And so they resided among the peasants. Sometimes they were barely distinguishable from the peasants. Okay, then you have the other subdivision of the nobility, the nobility of the robe. And so these were not the ancient, like the, not ancient, but like the old nobles that came from heredity. These originated from purchase or inheritance of royal offices. And so what you would have is the court, who was always in debt and trying to find money, they would sometimes sell these noble positions to these rich bourgeois, as we'll see later. That's a subdivision of the peasantry. And so a lot of these, so they controlled the parliaments, financial offices, and state administration. And they were mostly judges or members of the higher tribunals or parliaments. And so these were actually frequently wealthier than the sword nobles because, again, as I said, they came from the bourgeoisie and kind of bought their position. So they lived in cities, and they also played an important role in the French Enlightenment, as we'll see soon in this live here. Um, Montesquieu, one of the main figures of the Enlightenment, was actually a noble of the road, and so these guys, they would study in universities, and yeah, and so a little quote from a book I was reading. As soon as their own privileges were threatened, they became the stiffest of defenders of many of the most odious abuses of the old regime. Okay, this is important here. So, when we're saying nobles of the road played key points in French Enlightenment, well, they were the nobles of the robe were not considered to be at the same height of nobility as the nobles of the sword. They were thought to be inferior, and so many of them also wanted to change the present situation of France. But then, right when the revolution started getting too dramatic, they were the ones who, as it says here, became the stiffest defenders of the old regime. Okay, so what were the privileges of the nobles? They had many, and probably the most privileged estates. So, first of all, they had little or no taxes. They had exclusive rights of hunting. This is interesting because I didn't know this, but so what would happen is, so this was like the main preoccupant of, so dance, the lavish parties, and they would also go hunting. And what would happen is there would be wild boar or other animals that would mess up with the farmers, the peasants' crops, and they couldn't do anything about it because they did not have the right to hunt. And so they relied on the nobles to kind of hunt them, but then sometimes even when the nobles would hunt the animals, they would completely destroy the peasants' crops, which, as you can understand, they made the peasants even more angry against the nobles. And so they had feudal dues, so the peasants owed the nobility feudal dues. Some nobles had exemptions or reduced rates of salt tax, and we'll explain that more. But that was one of the abusive taxes of the time. Maybe you've heard of Oversimplified, but there's a really funny clip in Oversimplified that I might play, which really exemplifies what was happening with the taxes at the dawn of the revolution. So they held local courts to judge minor disputes. Peasants owed ceremonial difference to their load. We'll talk more about that when we actually talk about the peasants. Nobles were judged in special courts. So yeah, you had no equality under the law for the peasants, the nobility, and the clergy. We'll see the clergy was also judged in special courts, but the nobility always had the worst sentences, no rights at all. But as I said, we'll get into that. They could not legally be tortured or executed by hanging. Nobles so they were actually executed by I don't know, by a what's it called, a hatchet, I think, or an axe. There we go. Instead of the hanging. Oh, dang it. Um, Nobles took a cut when peasants sold or transferred land on their seigneury, and the provincial nobility, like the lower clergy, were themselves discontented with the existing order. So yeah, I already explained that. All right, next page. So then you have the second estate, or this is actually called the first estate. The nobility is the second. Oh, by the way, the nobility is around like 1.5% of the population, and the clergy is around 0.5 of the population. And they are the members of the Roman Catholic Church, with at the head the Pope in the Vatican. All right, so let's look at the story. So you have Constantine, which declares. I think it's a little bit the emperor after Constantine declares the Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and so then you have the Pope who resides at in the Vatican, and then you have Charlemagne, as already explains, that really Christianizes the whole area. And so you have this setup of bishops and archbishops in kind of like this is the same system as the nobility, but just for the clergy. You have the Pope at the top, and then under it you have the archbishops, then the bishops, and then you have the priests. And I think there's a little bit of different there's some stuff in between, but that's about it. And so, as we'll see, again, this is subdivided into two divisions. There's the high clergy and the lower clergy. And so the high clergy were about 5,000 to 6,000 ecclesiastics, and these were the bishops and archbishops, as you can see from the photo I put behind there. And this is so when the nobility, they had multiple sons and daughters. As I said, the first would become the heir, but then the other sons would go into the clergy, and especially the high clergy, and they would become bishops and archbishops and dioceses. And so, a little quote from a book here: eager to accept the salaries, but not disposed to perform the duties. And so, yeah, this is they just were the high clergy were exactly like the nobility. There were barely any differences. Like, the only ones were their dress code, basically. Not at all like the lower clergy, as we'll see later. And so the high clergy again resided at most of them resided at court in Versailles. Some of them had massive palaces, like the Archbishop of Strasbourg. So you can only tell They were from the church by their dress, and they had scandalous morals. They weren't Christians. They were just the second and third sons of the nobles. They had a little bit of education, more of course than the peasants, but they weren't really educated in the affairs of religion. And this is where you get all the miscontents with the actual church, is from the high clergy, the people who call themselves members of the church but really didn't uh, act acted in any way as the Bible said they should. And so they had an average income of around 50,000, I don't know why it's dollars, it's francs. And so a great example of this is the Archbishop of Strasbourg, who had an income of 300,000 francs a year and held high court in a splendid palace entertaining 200 guests at a time. I think he had something like 170 horses. You realize this is not at all um nothing to do with the actual church. They just wanted to live lavish lives. And so this is completely different from the other subdivision of the clergy, which is the lower clergy. So these were thousands and thousands of parish priests, and you had little other ones. Um, and so they did the actual work of spiritual consolation and instruction, and they labored faithfully in the vineyard. They were unlike the high clergy, who were the sons of the second estates. The lower clergy were the sons of the third estates. They were treated as peasants. Their incomes fewer, were a few hundred francs a year. Basically, they were undistinguishable from the peasants, and this is much like the nobles of the provinces. And you'll see when the revolution happens, a lot of the lower clergy actually joins into the third estate. You have the Abbé of Sieyès. I think he might have been a little bit more of the high clergy, but and so these two were bitter of their superiors, as you can imagine. The Archbishop of Strasbourg getting 300,000 francs a year, while these are just getting a mere 100 francs. These guys are actually working and doing the work of that the archbishops are supposed to do. And so they saw injustice in the existing system. And so the clergy as a whole also had many privileges. So they had little or no tax, example of land tax, income tax, they had reduced rates of salt tax. Everybody, including the nobles, had to pay them the tithe, I think it's called. So the church collected 5 to 10% of tax on agricultural produce from all landowners, including peasants and nobles. This provided enormous revenue. So they owed no feudal dues, they had no military requirements. They tried in ecclesiastic courts, ecclesiastic authorities supervise religious censorship under royal oversight. So yeah, these were really the censorers. So there was two censors at the time. There was nobility, which would censor anything against the regime, but there was also the church that would censor anything that was blasphemous in their what they said is blasphemous. And so what always happens under censorship, as you probably know, is the more you censor, the more people want to figure out and get interested in what you're actually censoring. It's like an opposite effect of what you're actually doing. And sometimes it takes time. So in every case, whatever you censor becomes bigger than if you would not have censored it. And so clerks could not legally be tortured or executed by ordinary means. The Catholic Church was the state religion. I think that's up until 1787, when when they changed that. Charged for sacraments and ceremonies, and could exclude individuals from the sacraments, which was a big deal back then. That was kind of being like excommunicated from the church in some way, which was a big deal. All right. And so now we really get to the most important estates, the third estate. And the third estate weren't all peasants, okay? There's three classes. There's the bourgeoisie, the artisan, and the peasants. And so the bourgeoisie, these are what we would call today the upper middle class, with the upper class being the nobility. So these are all those who were not manual laborers. They were lawyers, physicians, teachers, literary men, merchants, bankers, and manufacturers. And so when I was studying the French Revolution, this is when I really realized that it wasn't really a grassroots upheaval, because I forgot the numbers, but the bourgeoisie aren't the majority of the population at the time, far from it. But these were really the people who resented the situation, the political situation the most at the time. These were the real people who wanted reform. And so, why is that, you might ask? But the reason is because they considered themselves as well educated as the nobles, as well informed, as well intelligent, but they were considered to be lower. They were considered, there was really, when we talk of social differences, and it's like the Marxist ideal. Well, back then it was really a real thing. The nobles and the clergy were really considered to be the higher, kind of a higher form of person. And so, just to make a few quotes here, these were the practical businessmen who men who loaned money to the state and who were frequently appointed to offices where business ability was required. Intelligent, energetic, educated, and well-to-do, this class resented most keenly the existing system. And so here we talk about the men who loaned money, so the bankers. And I think of people like the Rothschilds, who, I think the Rothschilds then went into the nobility with Lord Mayor Rothschild. But at first, they were part of the bourgeoisie, and then they. Oh, dang it, I always do that. And so here's another quote from a book I was reading. They therefore favored a political reorganization which should enable them to participate in the government, to control its expenditures, to assure its solvency, that thus they might be certain of their interests and principle, that thus abuses which impeded or injured business might be redressed, and that the precariousness of their position might be remedied. And so this is where you really start seeing what I was talking about when I was saying prepared, planned, and orchestrated. These were the actual people who fomented the revolution. It wasn't the peasants. Of course, the peasants are always used and propagandized to actually foment a revolution. You have to have a large mass of people to, and not a large mass of people, but you have to have like enough of the enough of percentage, even though even if it's like a small percentage, like 5%. And so you have these bankers who are lending vast amounts of money to the states, as we'll see later, and who are starting. And so the book I was reading, which is a mainstream book, presents it like they were scared. They loaned the money, and then they were scared that they might get it back. But I was thinking, this is a personal thought here. What if they loaned the money knowing the government wasn't going to pay it back, and then creating all the problems? Because as we will see, what really caused the revolution is the financial situation of the kingdom. And so you have these people who were well educated, they were as cultivated as the nobles, and they wished for social equality. They really wanted them to be in power. It's always a power dynamic. Right now, you have the nobles who are in power, and then during a revolution, it always switches. It's never the peasantry which becomes power. It always switches from here's the nobles, then it's going to be the bourgeoisie, and then the new bourgeoisie are going to replace the old bourgeoisie. It's always a cycle like that. And so this is we're at the beginning of a cycle where we have people who are being enlightened by these like figures like Montesquieu, Voltaire, who was a bourgeois. You have Rousseau, Diderot, all these people, and they were really the ones who wanted the revolution and who created the revolution, as we will see. So then you have the artisan class, and this is the class. Well, it's the artisan, it's not the most important class. It's also not the biggest. It's around 2.5 million, and they're just the skilled manual workers. So not the peasants who aren't skilled and are working on farms. So these lived in towns and city like Paris, Toulouse, Marseille, and they were organized into guilds or corporation de métier, as it's called in French, and they were really regulated in training, quality, and access to trade. Not the most important subdivision. So then you have the peasants, and this is the largest section. And when I was talking about needing people for a revolution, this is who the bourgeois really, the artisan a little bit too, but mostly the peasants, because as we'll see, their situation is really awful. So they're around 220 million, sorry. A million of them were serfs, which is basically slavery. Well, you see a lot of that in Russia back in the day. It was really it was really everywhere in France before, but by now it's largely grown away. And so serfs are slaves. They are owned by their lords, but most of them right now are free men. And so so they included peasants, tenant farmers, and day laborers, which we'll just call them peasants because they are. They produced almost all of France's food and raw materials. They lived in small villages or hamlets of a few dozen families. Literacy was slow but slowly rising thanks to parish schools and church influence. And this is something that I think was really fascinating. We always think of the church as against science and all and literacy and all that, but back in the day, it was really the church who was propagating, who set up the universities and who was educating the peasants, which I think was a really good thing the church did. And so this was a religious society, as I said right there. Religion played a huge role. I think like probably over 99% of the population was religious. Most were Roman Catholic, a little bit were Protestants, even though there was a lot of executions of them in France. Some were Jews. And so this is not a time when atheism is at all, even in the minds of like people like Voltaire, who many believe was atheist, but he himself, many of them were actually deists, so they didn't believe in the Christian God, but they still believe in the God. Like I would probably say 0.01% of the population, even maybe less, were atheists. It probably didn't even exist back in that time. And so they paid 55% of their earnings to the states. And so right when you would get a disaster, a natural disaster, they would go into revolt, because when you're paying 55% of your earnings to the states and then the rest you have to, that's 2.5, like 3 days of your work week gone just to pay your taxes. That's a substantial amount. And I was listening to this one guy, and he was saying right when 75% of your earnings go to like either taxes or normal expenditures like food, this is when you get revolutions. And so here we're already way past that. 55% go to the states in taxes. probably like 40% go 44.5 goes to feeding, and they're still um barely making it. And so whenever you get a disaster, they're going to starve, and that's when you're going to get revolt, as we saw in the in I think it was 1788, when there was a horrible year for the farmers and bread prices just shot up. But we'll see that later. Okay, this is where we see the inequality of the situation. So this is a little recap that's ChatGPT made, but I was just looking through it, and all these are perfect, but it's nicely presented too. So peasants bore the heaviest tax burden of the three estates. So first were feudal dues, and so this is dues to their lord, the lord of their village. And so they had the cens, so rent for holding lands. Then you had the champart, a share of the crops. So every time they would have their little field where they would get their crops from, and then you will see. So some of those crops, that's the champart, had to be given to the lord. Then you have the corvée seigneuriale, where days were passed on the lord's farm. So not only did you have to share a little bit of your farm to the lord, you had to go and work on his farm. And so then you had so the peasants um had to use the lord's equipment. So if that was a mill, an oven, a wine press, and many of these were like 5 hours away over creeks and would take days. And sometimes the water level of these things, because many of them ran on water, wasn't high enough, and so then you would have to wait hours again and even pay a fee to go and use somebody else's mill, somebody else's wine press. And so it just much of this is money, but there's also time. Imagine just like a whole entire day's passed just trying to get your grains milled. And so, as I was talking, also they didn't have any hunting rights. So lords could hunt on peasant lands, often ruining crops, a major source of anger. So then you had the tithes, or la dîme. So this is paid to the church, and it's typically 1/10 of the harvest, although often closer to 7 to 8%, supposed to support parish priests and poor relief, but most went to higher clergy or monastic institutions. Peasants saw it as an unfair, since wealthy churchmen collected it but rarely lived locally. And so then a, the third tax was the state taxes. Not only did you have to pay taxes to your feudal lord, you also had to pay taxes to the state. And this is kind of what it is in America right now, even though so you had to pay taxes. Think about it like you have to pay taxes to your municipality, to your state, and to your country. And so, but this is just way worse. You had in state taxes, you had la taille, which is the main direct tax on lands. So you had land tax, then capitation, which is a head tax, uh, and then you had the vingtième, an income tax meant to fund war, but rarely fairly enforced. You have the gabelle. This is the salt tax. So the salt tax is really the crazy thing. You were obliged to buy a certain amount of salt, like I think it was something like 7 kilos for every uh, adult over 8 years old, and then they would tax you on that salt that you were supposed to buy. And then if you had salt and you kept it over from last year, you were taxed on that. Just a bunch of crazy stuff. And so then you corvée royale, compulsory labor on roads and infrastructure. So, by the way, if you guys have any questions here, you can ask them in the you can just type them in chat. I'll respond to you. Okay, so back to the thing here. Where were we? Uh, Hope you guys can hear me. If you can't hear me, chat, type something in chat. That'd be really annoying. All right, so this is the so this is just a breakdown. So they paid all and so this is about the third estate. So they paid all direct and indirect tax, paid dues, rents, thefts, and owned corvée, subject to all common and royal courts, harshest penalties, seen as inferior, socially and politically subordinate, poor education, as we've already talked about, limited literacy except among the bourgeoisie, legally restricted from wearing certain fabrics, weapons, or symbols of rank. The Third Estate was subject to all laws and taxes, but had no political power and could not access noble titles, could not become army officials or high ranking clergy. All right. So we've talked about a little bit of the government in France. And so you have the king at the top, and the seigneurie, and the and then you have the grand seigneur, the petit seigneur, and then the knights underneath. So what I really want to harp on here is there's absolutely zero liberties nor equality in the system. You have no liberty of religion, as we have already seen. The Protestants were brutally prosecuted. There's no liberty of expression with immense censorship. You have one of the most famous writers of a little bit before this was La Fontaine, if you guys have heard of him. And what he did particular is he would take these people kind of like Animal Farm, and so he would put them into animal forms, and so the king would be a lion, the clergy would be another animal, and so then he would make little stories, and you'd have to kind of understand what he was saying because all these animals actually represented people in the government, and so that he wouldn't be censored, he couldn't say, "Oh, Louis the 14th is blah blah blah." He would say, "Oh, the lion is doing this" or something like that. And so you have no liberty of expression, no liberty of religion, and then you could be arrested. I think it was like lettre de cotation. I think that's what it's called, but fact check me there. And any person could write one of these letters, and then you would be there was no like justice. So someone could, if someone had a grudge against you, they could write one of these letters, and then you would go to jail. That would be writing the letters. And so you see with people like Voltaire, which we'll talk about later, he was exiled into the Bastille, and he was exiled into Britain for a large part of his life. Then he went to Switzerland, and so you really have no liberty or equality. And also, what you have to understand is France wasn't like the France of today. It wasn't a unified country. It was still, even after Louis the 16th, the kingdom wasn't really unified under the French monarch. In like theory it was, but in the practical sense it wasn't. You had um so the taxes, this is one of the main um grudges of the peasants, was that the taxes in different king like sub kingdoms weren't the same. Here there was low taxes, here there was high taxes. The language also, there wasn't a common language. That comes after the revolution, the 1850s, where it really started being French. And so you had like the Gascon, then you had Breton, and you had other things. And also the laws, and this is where after Napoleon, who generalizes the civil code, but when you went into one seigneurie, there would be different laws, and then another different laws. And also, it wasn't united in the sense that there was actually what's it called? There were taxes when you would pass. I'm just blanking on the word here. When you would pass food or items from one seigneurie to the other, you had to pay a tax. Trump is all over this right now. Um, you guys know what I mean. So you had to pass a tax when you food or plot affairs couldn't be passed around the kingdom freely. There was no free trade. And so all of this just created an ununited states where no one felt any patriotism to the French state. Many of like the peasants were um, did believe in the king, but there was no real unity. And then you have the kingdom in debt. And so these are a bunch of citations I took from this book. But we'll see a little bit later what really created the debts. And so this is a little succession of events right before 1789. So you have Turgot. So Turgot announced his program to the king in the words: no bankruptcy, no increase of taxation, no more borrowing. He hoped to extricate the national finances by two processes: by effecting economies in expenditures and by developing public wealth so that the receipts would be larger. The latter object would be achieved by introducing the regime of liberty into agriculture, industry, and commerce. And this was really unpopular, especially with the queen. I forgot exactly what I was reading. And so then he was and the peasantry really loved this person, and so when um, Louis XVI fired him, that also created an upheaval. And so then you get Necker after him, a Genevan banker who succeeded Turgot. He was a man who had risen by his own effects from poverty to great wealth. So this is one of these bourgeois who was able to make it as a banker, kind of like the Rothschilds, if you know anything about their history. So he too encountered opposition since he proposed economies. He took a step which infuriated the members of the court. He published a financial report showing the income and expenditures of the states. And so I'm reading this, and what I'm thinking is, so you got this Genevan banker here, and he comes in, and instantly, I don't know about instantly, but he publishes the expenditures and incomes of the state. Like, if I was trying to help the nobility, I would do the complete opposite. If I was trying to help the revolution, this is what I would do. I would show everybody, especially the bourgeois who were really looking at all this stuff, what is actually happening. You remember, as I said before, the bankers were worried that they weren't going to get their money back, and so this man, a banker himself, has just published the income and expenditures of the states. And I should have had a graph here, but I was looking at this graph, and you can easily find one. In 1798, if you look at the receipts and then expenditures, so your receipts is mostly taxes, and there's a little bit of other stuff, how they got money. But then when you look at the expenditures, it's over 50% of the expenditures is on um I'm blanking again. Interest is on interest to the loans. So we're not even talking about the loans. We're talking about interest of the loans. This is kind of what's happening now in the United States and many countries is they've taken so many loans out, and they have no more money. And so 51%, I think it was, of the money they're getting, they're instantly putting it not into repaying back the loans, but just the interest of the loans, which is just mind-boggling. And they were, and so, and this is like a cycle. You get a loan, you can't pay it back, and so to pay back the interest on the loan, you get another loan, and then you can't pay back that loan, and so you get another loan to pay back the two other loans, and so it's just a cycle of never ending debt. And so let's get back to the thing, but that's really what what created the revolution. And so then you gotta be thinking, who are these people who are giving the government this debt? And did they do it on purpose? Because they knew they had to know that the the kingdom couldn't borrow any more debt. Because as you'll see, let's just keep reading here. So this has never been done before, secrecy having hitherto prevailed in such matters. The court was indignant that such high mysteries should be revealed to the masses, particularly as the report showed just how much went annually in pensions to the courtiers, as free gift for which they rendered no services whatsoever. For such unconscionable audacity, Necker was overthrown, the king weakly yielding once more to pressure. Oh, dang it. At this time, the court took no chances, but secured a minister quite according to the heart's desire. In Calonne, no minister of finance could be more agreeable. Calonne's purpose was to please. To please he did, for a while. The wand of Prospero was not more felicitous in its enchantments. The members of the court had only to make their wish known to have them gratified. Calonne, a man of charm, wit, of graceful address, had also a philosophy of gentle art of spending, which was highly appreciated by those about him. A man who wishes to borrow must appear to be rich, and to appear rich he must dazzle by spending freely. Money flowed like water during these halcyon times. In 3 years, in a time of profound peace, Cologne borrowed over, wait for it, 300 million francs. It seems too good to be true, and it was, by far. The evil days drew nigh for an accounting. It was found in August 1786 that the treasury was empty and there were no more fools willing to loan to the state. And so you have Turgot here who reveals the financial report of the state. And so these bankers and these people who are giving the loans know what's happening to the kingdom, but they still give them borrow $300 million. Like, if I was a banker and I saw that the state was literally in financial ruin and was never going to be able to repay me these millions of dollars I'm giving it to it, I wouldn't give it to it. And so you would believe the only reason they're giving them the money is that they want them to be more and more in debt, and they want a revolution to happen. This is only my mindset, but let's keep going here. So, the cause of the revolution, the social inequality we've already gone over. And so now there's the Enlightenment and the financial situation, including the food shortages. And so the Enlightenment, and this really starts at the beginning of the 18th century. And you have Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. These are the main people of the 18th century. Montesquieu, who was actually a noble of the robe, and he, if I remember correctly, he was a judge, and he had gone to university to study to be a lawyer, and then became a judge. And he wrote, I forgot the name of the piece, but it's quite famous. And he was explaining that he wanted separation of the three branches. And so he was big on that, the separation of the executive, legislative, and judicial, which at that time in France was all under the single person of the king. And so then you have Voltaire, which was almost more of an extremist, more of an ideal man, like a man in ideals, and he wrote many letters criticizing the government. As I said, he was exiled to England. He had multiple stays in the Bastille, which was basically the political prison of France. And then you had Rousseau, which I forget a little bit about what he did, but he was also a staunch advocate for reform. And what you got to understand is none of these were people, even Voltaire, were calling for the overthrow of the king. They just wanted reform. They wanted there to be a little more liberty. And this is where it gets really interesting because once I'll start diving into the succession of events of the revolution, at the beginning, even towards the middle, no one wanted the king to be overthrown. You got to make this clear. The the king was a sacred part of France. People just wanted there to be a little bit more liberty, a little bit more equality. But never in a million years was anybody even thinking of overthrowing the king. Even the most hardcore Republicans, which was the people who advocated for a republic, only started after in like I think it was 92 when the king tried to flee. Everybody, especially Voltaire, Montesquieu, really only wanted a system kind of like in England, a parliamentary monarchy, not an absolute monarchy. And so these people were really the foundation of the Enlightenment. And when I was talking about the bourgeoisie who were educated, these are the people that the bourgeoisie were reading um, decades later and getting their ideas from. So then you get into the financial situation, and a lot of people put way too much emphasis on the Enlightenment as being the cause for the revolution. And you might get enlightenments, but if you don't have a crisis, you're never going to get revolution. And this you see this in the Russian Revolution, where at some point everything was looking good, and so Lenin couldn't get his upheaval, but then things went bad, so he got it anyways. And so the financial situation really starts with this first 7 Years' War, and this is really the First World War. It happens in Asia, Europe, America, and you have two teams, you could say. You have England and Prussia, and then you have Russia, Austria, and France. And so France owned a bunch of lands in America, and England did, of course, as with the colonies. And then England just absolutely destroyed them. And the France, Austria, and Russia just got destroyed everywhere. Right? Prussia was really a new state under, I think it was, I forgot his name, but this leader who really and so there was France, Austria, and Russia against this little new state called Prussia, and Prussia was able to over like 30 years was over able to defend its territory. And then on the other side, England just won every single battle. And so this is where really when um France started putting a lot of money into military and then was borrowing a lot of money, which had made interest rates go even higher. And this is under Louis the 15th. And so yeah, and so then you get to Louis the 16th, and there's right when he takes office, you could say, starts the reign. There's the American Revolution, and so France wants to get back. It wants to get back. It wants to get back to the English who beat them in the 7 Years' War, and so they finance the American Revolution, which is kind of ironic when you think of it, because this is a revolution against a monarchy, and France supporting the revolution is a monarchy. And so, as we all know, America won, and they and the Americans never repaid French for all the money they gave to the Americans. And so, again, under Louis XVI, now you have even more debt, even more interest. And of course, you have the extravagances of the nobles, and this was really perfectly illustrated by Marie Antoinette. And I haven't spoken enough of Marie Antoinette, but she was an Austrian princess from I forgot, I'm blanking on the name of the Austrian queen, Marie. Marie Therese, I think it is. And so she's pictured as a foreigner, and we'll see there's a lot of propaganda distributed to the masses by these people, or at least that's the claims are that are made, um, to really paint a horrible image of her. Of course, I don't think she was a good person, and she did have extremely lavish lifestyle. Of course, you have the notorious image of her with her hair made out of a boat. She would make crazy she would dress crazily, and then you had the diamond necklace, which I think might have been a hoax, but I need to get more information on that. And that'll be next time we'll be seeing that. And so you just have the nobles are just partying lavishly, and then while at the same time the peasants are unable to get any food. And so what happens is in the year of 1788, I think there's a really hot summer and a really cold winter, and all the harvests are just destroyed. And I was looking at a chart, let's say I maybe find it, and it was just showing the price of bread just increase dramatically. It was kind of crazy. Let me see if I can see it. Yeah, look at this is right here. You can't see it, but I'll say so. 1778, you have prices at around 100, and then so you have not the prices. You have the amount of bread produced. It goes up, and then it spikes up in 1784, and then it goes all the way down. And while as in 1784 it was 160, which is an index, in 1788 it goes down all the way to 50, and the price of bread, of course, supply and demand just skyrockets. And so what you have is really, um, especially in Paris, because you must realize that this revolution wasn't really happening anywhere else. A little bit in this other big cities, but it was mostly in Paris. And so in Paris, the people, the peasants, were just starving, and that's what really created the revolution and really took the upheaval. And as we'll see, it was that combined with the taxes imposed that really started the revolution. But that's a video for another day. If you've enjoyed this stream I've done, and there's gonna be more coming, um, please consider subscribing. And to the next time.